Seville, 1596. The autumn rain falls on cobblestones worn smooth by a century of treasure. In the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, clerks work by candlelight, their quills scratching against parchment as they record the contents of the latest fleet from the Indies. Outside, armed guards escort wooden chests through narrow streets, their contents worth more than most European kingdoms will see in a decade. And in a private chamber above the counting house, a man named Pedro Fernandez de Córdoba holds a document that contradicts everything the Spanish people believe about their empire. The document is a ledger. It shows the crown's accounts for the current year, the income from silver, the obligations outstanding, the payments due. And at the bottom, a figure written in red ink that no public announcement will ever mention. The Spanish Empire, master of 2 hemispheres, commander of the most feared military in Europe, owner of the largest silver deposits ever discovered, is insolvent, not struggling, not strained, mathematically bankrupt. This is the 4th time in 40 years. The treasure ships have arrived on schedule. The silver is real. The guards are not escorting an illusion through the streets of Seville, and yet, within weeks, almost none of it will remain in Spain. It will flow outward to Genoa, to Antwerp, to Amsterdam, to the countless creditors who have first claim on every ounce before the crown can spend a single real. The greatest fortune in human history is passing through Spanish hands like water through a broken vessel, and no one in power understands how to stop it. This is the story of how wealth became a weapon turned against the nation that possessed it. How the conquest of an entire hemisphere produced not prosperity, but dependency. How silver, the metal that was supposed to guarantee Spanish dominance for centuries, became the instrument of Spanish destruction. It was not a tragedy of poverty. It was a tragedy of abundance. And the men who orchestrated it never fired a single shot. To understand the catastrophe of 1596, you must return 50 years earlier to a mountain in the high Andes that the Quechua people called Potosi. In 1545, according to the official account, an indigenous herder named Diego Hualpa discovered silver ore while tracking a lost llama. The Spanish authorities, ever alert to opportunity, investigated. What they found defied imagination. The entire mountain was silver. Not veins running through ordinary rock, but ore so rich that early miners could extract metal with nothing more than fire and gravity. The Cerro Rico, the rich hill, contained more precious metal than all the mines of Europe combined. It would produce silver for 300 years. Within a decade, a city rose around the mountain. By 1570, Potosi housed 160,000 people, making it larger than London, larger than Seville, larger than any city in the Americas. It was a city built entirely on extraction, fed by forced labor under the mita system that conscripted indigenous workers from villages hundreds of miles away. They descended into the mountain by the tens of thousands. Many never emerged. The human cost was staggering. Modern historians estimate that 8 million indigenous laborers died in the mines of Potosi over 3 centuries. The mountain consumed entire populations. Villages were emptied, lineages were extinguished, and the silver flowed. In Madrid, King Charles I and his son Philip II watched the treasure arrive and believed they had found the solution to every problem that had ever constrained royal ambition. War was expensive, but they now had wealth without limit. Enemies were numerous, but they could now outspend them all. They were wrong, not about the silver. The silver was real. They were wrong about what silver could do. The fatal miscalculation was simple. The Spanish crown believed that possessing silver was the same as possessing power. But power is not a substance. It is a relationship. And the relationship between Spain and its silver was about to be captured by men who understood finance far better than any Habsburg ever would. Enter the Genoese. By the mid-16th century, the Republic of Genoa had lost most of the Mediterranean trading empire that had once made it wealthy. Its rival Venice dominated the eastern routes. The Ottoman Turks had closed markets that Genoese merchants once controlled. The city-state's future as a commercial power was over, but the Genoese had developed something more valuable than trade routes. They had developed financial technology. Genoese bankers had pioneered instruments of credit and exchange that allowed them to move money across borders without physically transporting metal. They could advance funds in Antwerp against deposits in Seville. They could convert currencies, discount bills, and calculate compound interest with a precision that seemed almost magical to their clients. They had built a system. And in the 1520s, they found a client whose needs matched their capabilities perfectly. The Spanish crown was fighting wars on every front, against France for control of Italy, against the Ottoman Empire for control of the Mediterranean, against Protestant princes for control of the Holy Roman Empire, against rebels in the Netherlands, against England. The military commitments were constant, scattered across a continent and devastatingly expensive. But the silver from America arrived irregularly. The treasure fleet sailed once or twice a year, vulnerable to weather, disease, and pirates. A king cannot tell his soldiers to wait 6 months for payment. Unpaid armies mutiny, unpaid mercenaries switch sides. War operates on a different schedule than mining. The Genoese offered a solution. They would advance Philip credit against future silver shipments. They would deliver money to his armies in Flanders while the treasure was still crossing the Atlantic. They would convert his irregular windfall into a steady stream of liquidity. The price was interest, reasonable interest. Interest that compounded. Philip agreed. His father had agreed before him. The arrangement seemed beneficial to everyone. Spain got its money when it needed it. Genoa got its percentage. The wars continued. What no one in Madrid seemed to understand was that they had just surrendered control of their own wealth. Here is how the siphon worked. Each year, the treasure fleet departed from Havana, where silver from Peru and Mexico was consolidated for the Atlantic crossing. The fleet arrived in Seville, where the Casa de Contratación weighed and registered every bar and coin. The crown's share, the quinto real, the royal fifth, was extracted, and then the accountants went to work. First, they calculated the interest owed to Genoese bankers on advances already spent. The troops in Flanders had been paid 6 months ago with borrowed money. That debt now came due, with interest. Then they calculated the principal on previous loans. Spain had been borrowing against future shipments for years. Some of the silver now arriving had been promised 3, 4, 5 years in advance. It belonged to creditors before it ever touched Spanish soil. Then came the fees, currency exchange fees, insurance fees against loss at sea, transport costs to move metal from Seville to wherever it was actually needed, administrative charges. Each fee was small. Together, they were substantial. Then came the payments owed to other creditors. The Fugger banking family of Augsburg had financed Habsburg ventures for decades. They held claims. Other German banking houses held claims. Portuguese merchants held claims. The web of obligations was vast, overlapping, and legally binding. By the time every legitimate claim was satisfied, the mountain of silver had become a molehill. And in bad years, it became nothing at all. The crown owed more than it received. The fleet arrived full, and the treasury remained empty. This was not theft. Every transaction was documented, contracted, legal. This was finance. Philip II was not ignorant of his predicament. He could read ledgers. He could see that foreign bankers were extracting the wealth of the Indies before it could be used for Spanish purposes. In 1557, just 2 years after ascending to the throne, he attempted a radical solution. He declared bankruptcy. The Spanish term was decreto, a royal decree suspending payments to creditors. Philip refused to honor the debts accumulated by his father. He would renegotiate terms. He would break free from the Genoese grip. The financial world convulsed. Banking houses that had extended credit on the assumption of repayment suddenly faced catastrophic losses. The Fuggers, who had been the dominant force in European finance, never fully recovered. The system seemed to be collapsing, but the Genoese adapted. They accepted Philip's new terms. Short-term loans were converted into long-term bonds called juros, secured against specific tax revenues. The interest rates were lower. The timeline was longer. From Philip's perspective, he had won. He had reduced his immediate burden and humbled his creditors. He had done nothing of the kind. The Genoese had simply shifted their strategy. They now held juros that paid reliable income for decades. They sold these instruments to secondary investors across Europe, creating a market for Spanish debt. They became not just lenders, but intermediaries, taking fees on transactions they no longer directly controlled. Their exposure decreased. Their influence remained. And when Philip needed money again, as he inevitably would, they were there to provide it at new rates, with new conditions. The bankruptcy had not freed Spain. It had merely reset the terms of dependency. Philip declared bankruptcy again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596. Each time, he believed he was asserting royal authority over greedy financiers. Each time, he was actually tightening the knot. While the crown bled silver to foreign creditors, something equally destructive was happening inside Spain itself. The economists would later call it the price revolution. To the Spanish peasant, it felt like slow strangulation. When vast quantities of precious metal flow into an economy, prices rise. More money chasing the same goods means each unit of money is worth less. This is inflation, and Spain experienced it on a scale unprecedented in European history. Between 1500 and 1600, prices in Castile quadrupled. The cost of bread, meat, cloth, housing, labor, everything a person needed to survive, rose relentlessly. Wages could not keep pace. The purchasing power of ordinary Spaniards collapsed. But here is the vicious paradox that made Spain's situation uniquely cruel. The inflation was most severe in Spain because that is where the silver entered the European economy. Spanish markets felt the impact first and hardest, but the silver did not stay in Spain. It flowed outward to pay debts, to purchase foreign goods, to finance wars in distant territories. Spain experienced all the costs of monetary expansion and almost none of the benefits. The metal was a current passing through the nation, leaving behind only the wreckage of its passage. Rising prices destroyed the competitiveness of Spanish manufacturing. Why would anyone buy Spanish cloth when Flemish cloth was cheaper? Why would anyone buy Spanish tools when English tools cost less? The industries that might have absorbed the silver and created lasting wealth could not survive the inflation that the silver itself caused, and so Spain became dependent on imports. Foreign goods flowed in to meet Spanish demand, and silver flowed out to pay for them. The nation that possessed the world's richest mines became a conduit, not a destination. The countries that received the silver, the Netherlands, England, France, used it to build industries, finance trade networks, and invest in productive capacity. They converted Spanish metal into Spanish decline. It was not an accident, it was an extraction. Legal, efficient, and utterly devastating. No event illustrates the financial dimension of Spanish collapse more clearly than the Dutch revolt. In 1568, the provinces of the Netherlands rose against Habsburg rule. The causes were religious, political, cultural. Protestant communities refused Catholic authority. Local nobles resented centralized control. Merchants bridled at taxation imposed from Madrid. The rebellion was genuine, rooted in grievances that transcended economics. But the war itself was economic. The Spanish army of Flanders was the finest military force in Europe. Its tercios were feared on every battlefield. In any direct engagement, Spanish soldiers could defeat Dutch rebels decisively. And they did, repeatedly winning battle after battle while somehow losing the war. The problem was not military. The problem was financial. An army in the field requires constant payment. Soldiers who are not paid do not fight. Worse, soldiers who are not paid mutiny. They turn on civilians. They loot. They destroy the very territories they were sent to protect, and the Army of Flanders mutinied constantly. In 1576, unpaid Spanish troops sacked Antwerp, one of the richest cities in Europe. They killed thousands of civilians. They burned buildings. They looted everything that could be carried. The event became known as the Spanish Fury, and it turned moderate Netherlanders against Spanish rule more effectively than any Protestant sermon ever had. The sack of Antwerp was not a military strategy. It was a payroll failure. Philip II was pouring treasure into the Netherlands, borrowing against future silver shipments to keep his army fed and equipped. But the distances were vast, the logistics were complicated, and the creditors took their share before the money reached the front. Every ducat sent northward arrived diminished. Often, it did not arrive at all. The Dutch understood their advantage. They did not need to destroy the Spanish army. They needed only to outlast it. They built fortifications that required long, expensive sieges. They flooded their own land to make it impassable. They used their naval superiority to raid Spanish shipping and disrupt supply lines. Every year the war continued was another year of Spanish borrowing, another year of interest payments, another year of treasure diverted from any productive purpose. The Dutch were not fighting a military campaign. They were fighting a financial siege, and they won. Not in a single battle, but in 1,000 ledger entries. When Spain finally recognized Dutch independence in 1648, 80 years after the revolt began, it was not because the tertio had been broken on the battlefield. It was because the treasury had been emptied beyond recovery. The consequences extended far beyond the Netherlands. By 1600, Spain was locked in a cycle of debt that consumed nearly all of its silver revenue before it could be applied to any purpose. The crown borrowed to fight wars, fought wars to protect the territories that produced silver, and spent the silver servicing the debts incurred to fight the wars. The system was circular, self-reinforcing, and catastrophically inefficient. Philip III and Philip IV inherited an empire that was already hollowed out. They continued the wars because they could not afford the humiliation of retreat. They continued borrowing because they could not afford to stop fighting. They raised taxes on their own subjects to compensate for the revenues lost to creditors, driving productive Spaniards into poverty while foreign bankers prospered. The expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609 removed hundreds of thousands of skilled workers from the Spanish economy. The expulsion of Jews, a century earlier, had already eliminated much of Spain's mercantile and financial expertise. The Inquisition discouraged intellectual innovation. The obsession with purity of blood prevented social mobility. Every policy seemed designed to weaken the very capacities that might have allowed Spain to escape its predicament. By 1640, the empire was fragmenting. Portugal, annexed 60 years earlier, rebelled and regained its independence. Catalonia rose in revolt. Naples erupted. The composite monarchy that the Habsburgs had assembled was coming apart at the seams. And still, the silver flowed. Potosi continued to produce. The fleets continued to sail. The metal continued to arrive in Seville, pass through Spanish hands, and depart for foreign vaults. The mines were not exhausted. Spain was. The final collapse came at the turn of the 18th century. When King Charles II died in 1700 without an heir, the European powers went to war over who would inherit his crown. The War of Spanish Succession lasted 13 years and killed hundreds of thousands of people. It was fought in Spain, in Italy, in Flanders, in Germany, on the seas, and in the colonies. But here is what matters. It was not fought by Spain. The nation that had been the dominant power in Europe for 2 centuries was now a prize, not a player. French and Austrian armies marched across Spanish territory, each claiming to represent the legitimate king. Spanish armies existed, but they were irrelevant. The decision would be made by foreign powers. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht ended the war by partitioning Spanish territory like the estate of a bankrupt. Spain lost the Netherlands to Austria. It lost Gibraltar to England. It lost its Italian possessions. It lost the Asiento, the contract to supply slaves to its American colonies, to Britain. A Bourbon prince took the Spanish throne, but he ruled a diminished kingdom that would never recover its former position. Spain had become a second-rate power, dependent on French support, excluded from the commercial revolution that was transforming Europe. And in the background, barely noticed, the silver continued to flow. For another century, American mines would produce metal that passed through Spanish ports on its way to fund British industry, Dutch commerce, and French ambition. The conduit remained open. Only the illusion of ownership had been abandoned. History remembers the Spanish decline as a story of overreach and arrogance, of religious fanaticism that expelled productive minorities, of military commitments that exceeded resources, of administrative corruption that strangled initiative. These explanations are not wrong. They are incomplete. The deeper truth is financial. Spain was captured by its own wealth. It built nothing with its silver because it spent everything servicing debts incurred to access that silver faster. It created no financial institutions of its own because the Genoese had already built them. It developed no manufacturing base because inflation made Spanish goods uncompetitive. It invested nothing in productive capacity because all investment flowed to war and interest payments. The empire did not fall because it lacked resources. It fell because it lacked systems. The Genoese had systems. The Dutch had systems. The English would build systems. They created structures that captured value and compounded it. Spain created only the capacity to dig. The contrast with the Netherlands is instructive. The Dutch had no silver mines. They had no global empire when they began their revolt. They had only commerce, finance, and organization. Within a century, they had built the wealthiest society in Europe. Their banks financed global trade. Their ships dominated the seas. Their investors created the first stock market, the first multinational corporation, the first modern instruments of capital accumulation. Spain had the metal, the Dutch had the mechanism, and the mechanism won. Stand today at the foot of the Cerro Rico, the rich hill of Potosi, and you will see a mountain riddled with tunnels, exhausted, silent. The city that once housed 160,000 people now holds a fraction of that number. The streets that Spanish administrators walked, counting their fortunes, are quiet. The churches that silver built still stand, their Baroque facades crumbling in the thin Andean air. 8 million people died to extract that silver. An entire civilization was conscripted into darkness to pull metal from stone. The wealth of the Inca was melted down, stamped with Habsburg portraits, and shipped across the ocean to fund wars that accomplished nothing permanent. And Spain, the nation that organized this extraction, that claimed divine right over 2 continents, that built palaces and armadas and the most feared infantry in Europe, emerged from 3 centuries of silver poorer than it began. Poorer in industry, poorer in innovation, poorer in the capacity to generate wealth rather than merely extract it. The mines did not fail, the system did. The system that allowed foreign bankers to place first claim on Spanish revenue. The system that financed war through debt rather than taxation. The system that confused metal with power and spending with strength. The Genoese understood. The Dutch understood. The English understood. Wealth is not a substance to be hoarded. It is a flow to be directed. The nation that controls the mechanisms of finance controls the destination of wealth, regardless of who possesses the source. Spain possessed the source. Others built the mechanisms. And by the time anyone in Madrid understood the difference, the empire had signed away 3 centuries of treasure in contracts that were never meant to be escaped. The lesson is not that silver was cursed. The lesson is that wealth without systems is merely material in transit. The question was never who owned the mines. The question was who owned the debt. No army conquered Spain. No invasion toppled the Habsburgs. The empire was not defeated in battle. It was defeated in interest payments and currency exchanges and loan covenants and bond offerings and the quiet arithmetic of compound returns. The conquest was legal. The conquest was documented. The conquest was signed by Spanish kings who believed they were exercising power while they were actually surrendering it. In the vaults of Genoa, in the counting houses of Amsterdam, in the ledgers that recorded every transaction, the real history of the Spanish Empire was written, not in blood, in ink. The richest empire in history did not fall to a greater power. It was hollowed out by the very wealth it thought would make it invincible, bled dry by bankers who understood what kings never learned, that the signature on a contract can be more powerful than any army, and that an empire built on debt belongs in the end to its creditors. Spain had the silver. It was never rich. It was only the passage through which wealth traveled on its way to those who knew what to do with it.